Beyond M1, what's next for Apple's flagship Mac chips? On November the 10th, Apple announced M1, their new processor core for Macs, their system on a chip which covers everything from processor, graphics, integrated memory, the works. They introduced it across the MacBook Air, MacBook Pro 13-inch and Mac Mini lines, but what is next after M1? Let's talk about it.
For the latest Apple news, rumors, and leaks, every weekday at 12 UTC. Join us in the iCave.
Thanks, Siri. Now, contrary to popular belief, M1 is not just an ARM chip, it's an entire Mac logic board with graphics, controllers, RAM, processor, all shrunk down onto a single chip. In fact, the whole of the logic board inside the new MacBook Air and MacBook Pro, and in fact the Mac Mini, is about the same size as a stick of RAM from a regular laptop PC. But now that we've had a sneak peek at what's actually coming from Apple's own silicon inside Macs, even though we don't actually have it in our hands yet, let's have a chat about what will come next in terms of Macs and the roadmap ahead for Apple Silicon. First of all, let's get this out of the way. Should you buy a Mac powered by Intel at this point? Absolutely not. I don't think there's any reason at this point that you should be buying an Intel-based Mac. Now, I do understand that there are a handful of people out there that really need to have boot camp, but I'll be honest, the fact that I was able to put boot camp on this thing cost me days and days of trying to get it to work properly. At the end of the day, it's just really not that worthwhile. I get it if you have specific software that you must use for work. Okay, fair enough, but I wouldn't be buying a brand new Mac at this point. If you have to get one, pick up a used one, flip it when the Mac that you need comes out, and you will probably not really lose much money. But let's get into what we've already got so far, the M1 chip that was announced this week by Apple. So what's inside the M1 processor? As well as a whole bunch of other stuff. In terms of the actual processor itself, you're getting 4 low energy efficiency cores, Ice Storm cores. These use about 10% of the power of the previous generation MacBook Airs, but also give basically the same performance as that MacBook Air with a dual core i3. Now that's just with the 4 high efficiency cores. Once we get into the 4 high performance chips, which are the Firestorm chips, that brings you a computer that is about 3 times faster than that previous generation MacBook Air, which is an insane jump in performance. That's like having 3 of those laptops all working together on the same task. We're normally talking in terms of like 15 to 20% jumps year on year. This is 3x, this is 300%. And on top of that, not only do we get way more performance, way faster computing, smoother everything, we also get ridiculous amounts of extra battery life. In the MacBook Air, you're looking at an extra 50% battery life, up to 18 hours on a single charge. That is pretty crazy. And then when we move on to putting that M1 SOC into Apple's MacBook Pro 13-inch, it gets even bigger battery gains because the battery in the first place was much bigger and it's coming from an even more power-hungry chip. So you get almost 100% extra battery life, moving up from 10 hours of battery to almost 20 hours on a single charge. Along with that, for your extra $300, you also get active cooling, so this chip is going to be cooled rather than the silent operation of the MacBook Air. You're going to get a brighter display, and you're also going to get the Marmite touch bar that Apple has included in a lot of their MacBook Pros recently. In the Intel ones, had to be powered by an Apple processor core. In this, it's all powered from the same place. All powered by that M1 chip. The chip itself is identical regardless of whether it's in the MacBook Air, the MacBook Pro 13-inch, or in the Mac Mini. And some YouTubers have suggested that the MacBook Air version might be limited to 10 watts of power consumption in order to keep the power low, because it doesn't have a fan sitting on there. However, when we start to look at the benchmarks, it doesn't look like that's the case at all. Just to run you through these really quickly, the first column is single core and the second column is multi-core performance. So the Mac Mini is getting 1682 in single core and 7097 in multi-core. The MacBook Air is getting 1732 in single core, 7545 in multi-core, and the MacBook Pro getting 1717 in single core and 7423 in multi-core. Now, I understand that there are some differences here. We have a lot more benchmarks for the MacBook Air and for the MacBook Pro, so those are probably more representative. We could only find one benchmark for the Mac Mini, which I think might mean that that is possibly either a pre-production model, because it looks like it was running slightly underclocked, around about 3.06 gigahertz instead of 3.2 in some of the others. I think what's going on there is actually there was either other stuff running on the system at the time, or it was potentially slightly clocking down because it had been running multiple benchmarks in a row, and this was once it started to slightly thermal throttle. But the performance is still very similar, and there's no reason to think that it would run at a slower pace. When it is connected to the mains, it's not going to manage power as much, and it's also got an active fan, just like the MacBook Pro. But as you can see, it doesn't look at all like the MacBook Air is being throttled in any way for not having a fan in the design. That doesn't mean that it won't under sustained loads, but it certainly means that in these performance benchmarks, it wasn't getting hot enough that it was causing any problems at all. And performance benchmarks are pretty taxing. All that being said, there must be a reason that the MacBook Pro needs the fan. So I would assume under sustained workloads, if you're doing long video renders and things like that, that you are going to need it at some point. But right now, we're not seeing any reason for it. Once we get it in the real world, we'll probably see a little bit more, perhaps in gaming tasks as well. I would be very surprised at this point if Apple does introduce any more Macs that are based on Intel's architectures, purely because we've seen the huge change that Apple Silicon can bring to these Macs. And I can't imagine that many people are going to go, no, I think I'll go for the Intel version with the less performance for the more money. Because right now you cannot buy an Intel-based MacBook Air from Apple. They have replaced that line completely with Apple Silicon. But for the MacBook Pro and the Mac Mini, they are still offering SKUs that use Intel cores. And for example, when we look at the Mac Mini with the i7, which is the highest spec version that you can get, this is the most expensive, it scores 1150 on single core and 6351 on multi-core. And it's using integrated graphics, which Apple has said the integrated graphics in the M1 processor is going to be about 5 times the speed of any of the integrated graphics that they had previously. So the Mac Mini is going from 1150 to 1682, moving from Intel to Apple Silicon, and from 6351 to 7097, again moving from Intel to Apple Silicon, and probably going to be hitting more around that 7500 mark that the other two are getting already. Once we get a few more benchmarks out there and we can kind of average it out a little bit better. That's why I don't think Apple's going to be bringing out any more Intel-based Macs, because at the moment you cannot buy a Mac laptop that is faster than the Apple Silicon stuff that has just been released. That includes the top-of-the-line Intel i9 based 16-inch MacBook Pro, which clocks in again at 1118 and 6762 on multi-core. There have been references that have emerged to AMD's big Navi graphics cards. Now, I don't think that those are going to be for a MacBook. I don't think they're going to be for any of Apple's new products that they're bringing out. I think they are potentially drivers that are being put in place in case people want to put them into the Mac Pro, the top of the line, balls to the wall beast of a rendering machine that is literally designed for the very most professional users for who budget is not really a consideration at all. So what have we got covered already, and what is still to come in the coming year? Based on Apple not bringing out any new form factors, so sticking with the product line that they've got right now, but just updating them. MacBook Air, MacBook Pro 13-inch, MacBook Pro 16-inch, iMac, iMac Pro, Mac Pro and Mac Mini. And obviously we've got new product flags already on MacBook Air, MacBook Pro 13 and Mac Mini, because those are the ones that we've already updated with Apple Silicon. So let's focus on the ones that I think are going to be updated next, and that is the MacBook Pro 16-inch and the iMac. Now, assuming we're not going to get another product event this year, because right now Apple seems to love doing a monthly event, so a week before Christmas, who knows, maybe we'll get another Apple Silicon event that we weren't expecting. Although we've had reports that there are MacBook Pro 16 inches in the supply chain right now, with quantum computers, it sounds like they're not going to be ready for a little while, and I think if they were going to be coming out anytime soon, Apple would have mentioned them at the last event and potentially said, and coming in December, blah, 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 blah. So I think it's safe to say that we're going to be looking at March for our next event, which makes a lot of sense from a couple of standpoints. First of all, we've had March events before, and quite often Apple pitches these at the education market. Now, the iMac has long been a stalwart of the education market, with Apple producing configurations specifically for education. I think they did a 21.5-inch iMac that came with a Intel i3 processor, which was kind of the lowest end of the market that they were doing, at a lower price specifically for education. Now, the reason that they tend to have the education events at that time of year is because around March, April time is when the schools and colleges start looking at what they need to procure for the next academic year starting in September. The other reason that it's a really good time of year to do an event, especially in March rather than April, is because April tends to be when financial years end and begin. So any companies that have got a bit of budget left at the end of their financial year and they don't want to lose that budget from next year's as unspent, they will quite often update some of their hardware at that point. It gives them a really good reason to go with Apple, and anyone that had blown through their budgets for the year is able to buy them at the beginning of April when they know it's brand new and it's the latest thing, and they're not going to be seeing some other product to tempt them away from Apple anytime soon. I think the iMac is the most likely of Apple's products to get a full-on design refresh at this point. It has had the same look for about 8 years with the thin edge, and before that it looked exactly the same from the front, but it was a thicker design which also housed an optical drive in the side. But there have been a number of rumours that Apple is looking to bring its iPad Pro design language, which is also now in the iPad Air and also the latest iPhones, to its Mac lineup to look like a really big iPad Pro on a stick, basically. So slightly rounded corners on all of the displays, thinner bezels, and potentially even Face ID coming to the iMac for the first time. Now, we have already seen references to Face ID in macOS Big Sur. I'm not sure if they're still in there in the betas, but they were in there at the beginning. So we are expecting that Face ID will come to the Mac at some point. Now, regardless of the actual appearance of the Macs, I think we are going to be going up to larger displays as much as anything else. So expected is a 24 and a 30-inch display to replace the current 21.5 and 27-inch displays. And those current displays are at 4K and 5K resolutions, which would make all the sense in the world to bring the 5K to the 24-inch and maybe the 6K that we already have in the Pro Display XDR into the 30-inch monitor. Now, as that Pro Display XDR does come in around about $6,000, I think we'll probably see a slightly cheaper display technology coming into there. Although if Apple is moving into real kind of volume production, it might actually be that they can bring the prices down and maybe even the XDR displays come down in price too. In terms of the processors that are going to go into the iMacs and the MacBook Pro 16-inch model, assuming they stick with the 16-inch, I don't think they will go with the M2 name. I think that will be saved for the annual updates, but probably something more along the lines of an M1X or possibly a P1 for the Pro models. I think that Apple's chip series will be seeing annual updates the same as the A series, so that you know which year this product is from. The actual cores inside the processors will be very similar, but there will be a lot more of them, so they'll probably also be more biased towards the performance cores. So let's say we go for a 12-core processor, you would be looking at 4 of those Ice Storm efficiency cores and maybe 8 of the Firestorm high performance cores. That would give you a nice 12-core processor, which makes a lot of sense in this kind of product, and you would still get the power efficiency and therefore the huge battery life. Even with increased power draw that you would be looking at with these processors, the MacBook Pro 16-inch has got an enormous battery. I think it's literally as large as you can make it and still be allowed to take it on an aircraft. Battery life is still going to be pretty stellar, probably around about 20 hours, just like the 13-inch. Let's assume we're going to call it the M1X. That is probably going to have far more powerful graphics as well, possibly up to a 16-core processor for the graphics, a 16-core GPU, and it may start to get its own dedicated memory as well. So right now, all of the memory within the SoC is unified, which means that it's shared between the system and the graphics so that it can flex the amount that is needed for each as and when it needs to. I think with this, especially if they need to move the graphics cores off of the main SoC, it will get its own dedicated memory at that point. However, because a lot of the speed comes from the fact that the SoC is unified and keeps everything together, Apple will probably have to create or make use of their own very high-speed bridge between the two processors. There's very little point in trying to guess what kind of numbers we're going to see from these at the moment, because we haven't even seen the M1 in the real world. All we've seen is some artificial benchmarks that have come out, which gives you a good idea of how it will compare to other chips, but we've had nothing whatsoever to do with the M1X, assuming that's what it gets called. All I would say is that the jump between A12 to A12X was generally around 40%, and that has held true for most of the X series processors versus the originals, so I would assume it will be something in that ballpark. One question mark for me though is the Mac Mini. This was the most interesting one that was released at the event because nobody thought it was coming apart from us. I was talking about it since the beginning of September. When we saw inside that Mac Mini, there was a cutaway view that showed you the airflow, and let's be honest, most of that box is empty. So there's two options here. We can either fill that space with something else. Now, we don't need to put batteries in it or anything like that, but we could put beefier chips with more cooling, or we could probably get rid of the fan because we know that the M1 chip can run quite happily fanless in the MacBook Air, which could give us a smaller enclosure and a lower price point. Now, I said before the Apple Silicon event that I would love to see Mac Mini coming back to its $499 price point, which it famously started out at, and it was always Apple's cheapest Mac. The whole point was that it was to bring people in from Windows who had already got a keyboard, mouse and display that they could plug straight in, and away they go. Now, these days, I think there are very few households that don't have those things, whether the display be a TV or a monitor or a previous computer monitor, it doesn't really matter, but it gets you started. And Apple is pushing so hard on its services these days that it makes so much sense for people to come into the ecosystem. So I don't expect that the updated Mac Minis will come anytime soon, but once we've gone through a full year with M1, with our new M1X in March, which will be the same time of year that they would introduce the new iPad Pros, I can certainly imagine that M1 based Macs become a lot cheaper, just like last year's iPhone models did. So when Apple introduces M2 in September or October or November of 2021, we could quite easily expect to see M1 based systems staying around, not necessarily in every model, but a MacBook Air SE and a Mac Mini SE would be great entry points, with a $499 price point for the Mac Mini and a $799 price point for the MacBook Air SE. These would make them perfect for second computers or students or schools to use. Again, it hits that education market that Apple loves so much, and I think that could be a massive market for them. So next October, when M2 processors are introduced to embarrass the computer industry once again, don't be surprised if we get more of those SE products that Apple has started releasing with the iPhone, the Apple Watch, and I would guess that the entry-level iPad at some point soon will become the iPad SE 2. So in 12 months, or in fact quite a lot less than that, we've covered all of Apple's major bases apart from the Mac Pro. How will Apple approach this? We just don't know at this point. They introduced the $6,000 tower in 2018, and configurations for this go all the way up to $56,000. So it's not something that users are going to want to trash and get something new. However, if we take a look back at the Power Mac G5, which was the precursor to the Mac Pro back in the Power Mac days, the way that their processors were attached was very much like a PCI card. They were slotted into the board, sticking out just like any other card, with heat sinks attached, and they had a distinctive shield over the front so you could actually see whether it was a single or a dual processor model. My hope is that Apple has kind of considered this at the point 2 years ago of releasing the Mac Pro, that they were going to be bringing Apple Silicon out very, very soon, and that they have done something in a similar way where their architecture will allow for them to bring Apple Silicon to the Mac Pros without having to trash the whole thing. Maybe something along the lines of the Afterburner card would be able to slot into one of those slots, containing, rather than custom chips for the Mac Pro itself, containing 4 to 6 of these M1X style processors, which gives you up to 64 cores of processing. That would be absolutely stunning, a ridiculous amount of power, and to be completely honest, all it would need to take from the bus is actually getting its power and sending its I/O to the back of the computer. You'd be able to disable the Intel cores, because these system-on-a-chips run everything on the chip. The motherboard itself is doing very little other than delivering power to it. Who knows, maybe the Afterburner card's architecture already supports this kind of thing. We just don't know until Apple brings something out. There have also been rumours of a smaller Mac Pro tower that is potentially going to be coming. It could just be something that they're trialling in development, could be something that never hits the market, but it's been rumoured recently, so that could well be the Apple Silicon version that they're working on at the moment. But that would really upset some people that have spent a lot of money on that platform. So that kind of wraps up what I've got in mind for the Apple Silicon roadmap I think that we are going to probably see pretty much everything updated to Apple Silicon within the next few months, probably by March, and at the outside edge, I think we will have seen pretty much everything by June at WWDC, although they tend to try and focus that more on software than hardware. This might be one of the things that they make an exception for, like when they introduced the Trashcan Mac Pro at WWDC, and I think in 2018 they might have introduced their new Mac Pro there as well. So what did you think of this video, guys? If you've enjoyed it, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments what Apple Silicon Mac you are waiting for. Just before we go, we have got a new member to the notification squad. If you want to join the notification squad, subscribe to the channel, ring the bell, and you will get a shout out like this. And it is the Stafford family. Thank you so much for joining, guys. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next video.